Eskow. And joining me once again is Anatol Lieven. Anatol is director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And he is one of the people I trust to speak the truth and common sense about the situation there, a situation that is rapidly changing, complex, has a lot of variables that weren't there 6 months ago or 3 months ago. And so I'm hoping he can clear some of that up for us. So first of all, Anatol Lieven, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
Let's start with this. Let's start at the sort of 30,000 foot level. Given that there's been a shift in approach toward Ukraine with the change in administration, and President Trump and his team have been, at various times at least, pushing hard for a peace deal. We talk about the contours of that peace deal, but let's begin with, it's my sense that you think that overall that peace deal is something Ukraine should take and that people in the West should support. Am I correct about that?
Well, yes, but of course it depends on the terms of the deal, which are now indeed being negotiated, because Russia still, at least formally, has demands on the table that no Ukrainian government could accept or should accept, including withdrawal from additional territory, and effective disarmament. Now, the Russians have not withdrawn these. There have been, or officially qualified them. There have been suggestions or hints coming out of Moscow that they could be modified, but no firm proposals that we know of. And so, I mean, equally, of course, the Ukrainians and the Europeans have been making demands that are also quite impossible for Russia to accept. They are beginning to qualify those, but similarly, I mean, they haven't actually removed them. So there is, I think, unfortunately, still a long way to go. And of course, Trump has said that unless there is a full ceasefire soon, he will, in his own words, walk away from the peace process. I fear myself. Now, that doesn't mean that the peace process is over. It just means that, as in so many peace processes, there will be a longer or shorter interval in which the fighting will continue, and then, the negotiations will resume. But I'm not too hopeful, I have to say, of a peace agreement at this stage.
Well, let's talk about the context of these conversations then. It's been my sense that from the Russian invasion onward, illegal, we can object to it on, very clear grounds, but with a history of, one could argue, provocation behind it. It seems to me that the largest shift that's taken place with President Trump's re-inauguration is, it seemed to me as if any talk about negotiation was largely unacceptable to the power centers in the United States and Western Europe. So if that's a fair situation, then we really have this. It seems to me, but help me think this through. We have a situation where the United States president, and we could talk about, if he's biased toward Russia and his deal making or whatever, but we now have a United States president who's willing to acknowledge, I think, military fact that the war is unwinnable for Ukraine, and is willing to talk about negotiations. But we also have a political culture you've written about, let's say the European left and center, calling this traitorous and treacherous and betrayal, and many people in the United States are doing the same thing, so saying similar things. So I guess where that leaves us is, how do we advance this complex process? I mean, in the broadest sense, not of course, not us personally, but how do we advance this process when we have to not only persuade the parties to come closer together, but deal with the headwinds in Western political cultures? Does that question make sense to you?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I battle with this every day. But I think that to be brutally honest, that the answer is to some extent ignore them. And of course, the Ukrainians have to agree to many things, in the longer term, and so do the Europeans, especially when it comes to sanctions and Russian assets. But there is actually a lot that the US and Russia can agree on and should agree on between themselves to start with, and can then, basically present this to the other parties. But clearly, as I say, at the same time, the Russians have to give up some of their demands, and they haven't done so yet. And Trump has not surrendered to the Russians. He's put pressure on the Ukrainians with success to get them to agree to start negotiating, having begun with I mean, grotesque minerals deal with Ukraine, a proposal that would have basically given Ukraine's entire mineral natural resources to the United States. There has now yesterday been a much more sensible and equal, fair deal, which has shifted the balance back towards Ukraine. So this all and the Trump administration continues military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. So I think all of this talk about betraying Ukraine is ridiculous, because the fact of the matter is that the Biden administration refused to negotiate with Russia. But by a year ago, it was already entirely clear that the Ukrainians could not reconquer the territory that Russia occupied, that this was militarily impossible unless the United States went to war with Russia, which, of course, the Biden administration and every other NATO government had categorically said they would not do. So, I mean, in terms of basic realities, the Biden administration could have begun to negotiate a year ago or more. But of course, it did not have the will to do so.
And let's talk about this dimension of it, the question of U.S.-Russia direct negotiations versus trilateral or some other form of negotiations involving perhaps Ukraine, Russia, U.S., maybe Western Europe as well. But there have also been people saying that it's wrong for the U.S. to negotiate directly with Russia without Ukrainian involvement. But it seems that there are two layers of talks that need to go on. That one of them is an agreement essentially between Ukraine and Russia to bring the war to an end. The other is between the U.S. and Russia regarding the talk that was very forceful, it seemed to me, in the Biden administration and in Western Europe about admitting Ukraine to NATO, for example, and other, the positioning of U.S. missiles, perhaps, in that country, and so on. So it seems to me that there is a sort of non-aggression dimension between the U.S. and Russia that is appropriate for them to discuss between the two of themselves, as well as in concert with the Ukrainians. So the rhetoric, it seems to me, has been a little bit that, well, Trump people meeting with Putin people is wrong, but I'm not sure that that channel shouldn't be open as well. What do you think?
Well, there is still a Ukrainian law which hasn't actually formally been withdrawn, which makes it illegal for the Ukrainian government to talk to Putin. So, this is not Trump's fault. And of course, it's very familiar in peace negotiations to have separate tracks. If the two sides won't talk to each other. I mean, sometimes you have a ridiculous situation in which, they're in the same hotel, but they're in different suites, and then people shuttle to and fro between them. But there's nothing new about this. And yes, you're entirely right. There are some things which not only can be, but actually throughout the Cold War always were negotiated between Moscow and Washington. And then others were brought in, insofar as it affected their direct interests. And yes, I mean, The other thing is that, it's been said that it's the decision on whether to join NATO is up to Ukraine. No, it isn't. It's up to the existing members of NATO, and it's not going to happen because it implies, it states that they will fight to defend Ukraine, and they won't. And it only takes one veto to block, as Turkey showed, over Sweden last year or the year before. It only takes one country vetoing it to stop accession of a new member. Hungary will veto. Slovakia will veto, let alone the United States. If Le Pen wins in France, France will veto. So, this isn't going to happen. That's the first thing. Secondly, when it comes to the supply of American weapons to Ukraine, once again, that's not a decision for Ukraine. That's a decision for the United States. It, produces and gives these weapons. And even in the case of the European supposed weapons, it provides the intelligence to use them. This is a decision, once again, for Washington to be negotiated with Moscow. When it comes to wider arms talks, I mean, there are things which unfortunately do not seem to have been addressed yet, but which could be, an important part of these talks by way of basically, establishing a different overall relationship with Russia that would then advance the course of peace in Ukraine. For example, the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe. Trump walked away from the intermediate nuclear missile treaty. Biden and the Germans then announced that in response to the Russian stationing of these missiles, America in 2 years' time will deploy such missiles in Germany. But there's obviously the makings of a deal there whereby both sides agree to withdraw their weapons. There's the possibility of a deal whereby Russia has demanded that all new NATO troops withdraw from the new members of NATO in Eastern Europe. Well, that's certainly not acceptable to the Europeans. But I mean, what America can offer is it can say, look, the Europeans, sorry, they have to do what they want, but America will not station troops there. And given that, in the end, it is America that the Russians are really worried about, that's something that can be negotiated between Moscow and Washington. But of course, what Washington must demand in return for all this is that the Russians abandon or greatly qualify some of their demands to Ukraine, which the Russians have not yet done. I hope they will, but they haven't done it yet.
And as we watch those negotiations unfold, and Trump says he's walking away right now, but I would assume that's probably a negotiating tactic, a pressure tactic of some kind, whether he does or doesn't. But assuming that the negotiations will go on, one of the other things that I think people are struggling with is the idea that any settlement, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think any final agreement would include the loss of some Ukrainian territory that it had prior to February of 2022, that any agreement would leave in place some of the land that Russia has acquired during this war. And that seems very unjust to people. And I have a hard time, frankly, explaining to people sometimes that that's true, but that there is, first of all, some element of ambiguity about the nature of some of those regions, and also that today is today, reality is reality. And your colleague Graham Ellison at the Kennedy School wrote that the Ukrainians need to accept an ugly peace. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I mean, the thing is that the Ukrainians will not and cannot be asked legally to recognize the Russian annexations. They just won't do that.
Mm-hmm.
America, of course, can, and Trump has offered to recognize it in the case of Crimea, but nobody else will. Even actually the Chinese said they wouldn't, and the Indians and others. So all that the Ukrainians have to recognize is the fact that it is militarily impossible for them to reconquer these territories. All they have to accept, they don't have to accept formally the loss of these territories, they just have to accept a ceasefire along the existing battle lines, which is what the Trump administration is now proposing. And then, as in the Istanbul talks at the start of the war, or in the case of Cyprus, nobody has ever recognized the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or Kashmir. Nobody has ever recognized Indian or Pakistani rule over parts of Kashmir. The issue remains legally moot. But then this is deferred for future negotiation, which is what the Istanbul draft said. But as for the people in the West who say that this is unacceptable, well, if they think that it is absolutely unacceptable de facto to leave these territories in the hands of Russia, they have only one moral choice. I mean, that's to volunteer for the Ukrainian army themselves and go to fight to recover these territories. Because there's nothing very honourable about striking, hardline poses from armchairs, in Washington or New York or London, and urging other people, and clearly in the case of many young Ukrainians by now, very unwilling people, if you look at the resistance to conscription, to go and die for an actually impossible goal. I mean, that's why the Ukrainians will have to change, and indeed are changing gradually. I mean, it's one thing, to risk your life to defend your country, which of course the Ukrainians have done with astonishing and admirable success over the years. But it's quite another, to be thrown forward. To be slaughtered in the pursuit of a goal which your own generals know cannot be achieved. That is much more like the First World War, which is not, I think, a model that we should want the Ukrainians to emulate.
No, and we have, on record, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of this country I think it was November 2022, saying that the war was effectively a stalemate and that it was time for negotiations. So I think that accepting negotiations makes sense. But I think that you mentioned earlier the minerals deal. I think that also frustrates a lot of people. As you said, the initial proposal was, seemed excessive. On the one hand, I suppose by giving this administration and the U.S. government a self-interested reason to defend Ukraine, that part is good. But it also seems, I think, to a lot of people quite unjust to force a country that was attacked, and let's be honest, in part because of statements and actions from this country and NATO and so on, to ask them to give up their natural resources to us as a result. That objection, what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, as I said, the original proposal from the Trump administration was absolutely outrageous. I mean, it was colonial. It involved, and also it was totally dishonest because it said that this was compensation for US aid to Ukraine. But actually, the figure being named was well over 3 times total US aid to Ukraine. So no, I mean, utterly unacceptable and quite right for Kiev to reject it. The present deal looks much more equitable, and does involve US investment and the equitable division of profits. And I think from Ukraine's point of view, I mean, the main thing is, Ukraine is not going to get an Article 5 guarantee. It's not going to get European troops in Ukraine because Trump has refused to back them up. And now the Europeans themselves are saying, well, some of them always did. We won't do this because, once again, it implies we would go to war with Russia and without American support. European publics are absolutely against that. So the answer is that you have to find other ways of trying to not guarantee, because there are no absolute guarantees, but to strengthen Western commitment to Ukraine and Ukrainian security in the long run. One of these is accession to the European Union, if the Ukrainians can achieve it. Another is American investment in Ukraine, which means that a future US government won't go to war to defend Ukraine. But equally, it won't simply walk away if there is a new Russian attack. Sanctions will resume, military aid will resume. And then there are other things, there can't be a Western force in Ukraine. So you have to look at an agreement under the United Nations and a United Nations peacekeeping force. You have to look at not the ending of sanctions against Russia, but suspension with what has been called a snapback clause, which means that if Russia attacks Ukraine again, the sanctions automatically resume. These are all the different ways that one has to look at helping Ukraine in future and strengthening Ukrainian security. And I think the minerals deal is one piece of that.
You wrote that the other day that most of the peace plan, I'm quoting, most of the peace plan for Ukraine now sketched out by the Trump administration is not new, is based on common sense. And this is the part I wanted to ask you about, and has indeed already been tacitly accepted by Kiev. What are the parts that have been tacitly accepted?
That Ukraine won't get into NATO. Because, you see, this is often forgotten. But during the Istanbul talks at the start of the war, Zelenskyy said publicly, this is on the record, that before the war, he went to Washington and every major NATO capital and Brussels and asked, can you guarantee that within 5 years, Ukraine will be a member of NATO? And they all said no. No, we won't guarantee that. We won't. And Zelenskyy then said publicly, well, look, at that point, why not a treaty of neutrality? It's clear that NATO is, not going to take us in, but with guarantees. And then, of course, it became a question of what guarantees. So, in fact, Zelenskyy tacitly, or indeed not tacitly, openly accepted this 3 years ago. General Zaluzhny, the then Ukrainian commander-in-chief, 2 years ago, said basically that there's no chance now of breaking through the Russian lines. We have to wait for completely new technologies, which, of course, are not going to happen soon, or certainly not, on a scale that could reverse the Russian superiority and allow the Ukrainians to attack. So tacitly, the de facto ceasefire line has also, I think, been accepted by the Ukrainians. What they were still hoping for desperately was a European force for Ukraine, but it's clear now they're not going to get that. I think they will soon accept that as well. But we are left with, as I say, the things they cannot accept. The demands for more territorial withdrawal, the demands for disarmament, that no Ukrainian government can accept. And, America, and I mean, if America were to agree to that, not just limitations on certain Ukrainian arms, like long-range missiles, for example, that I think is doable, but to reduce the Ukrainian army to a level where it couldn't defend Ukraine, no, I mean, if Washington agreed to that, yes, that would be betrayal of Ukraine. If Washington agreed to regime change, which the Russians have also, well, there have been different signals but certainly some people in Moscow still very much want that. That would be betrayal of Ukraine. But Washington has not, the Trump administration has not agreed to these things. And, well, the problem is that these issues, of course, are very, very complicated, because then you get into the whole question of, well, which weapons can Ukraine not have? Which can it have? When it comes to Ukrainian internal affairs, well, mind you, this was also agreed in Istanbul. Ukraine, in principle, they never got around to sign it, of course, but from what I understand, they basically were close to an agreement whereby Russian speakers in Ukraine would be guaranteed full linguistic and cultural rights. And Russia would do the same for Ukrainians in Russia, would guarantee the same rights. Seems entirely fair to me. But now, after 3 years of war, very difficult for the Ukrainians, because, of course, nationalism has risen to such an extent.
Right.
But the problem about this kind of thing is that these are not quick or easy things to negotiate. And Trump appears to be in a hurry.
Yes, of course. Let's talk about Zelensky's role in all this a little bit, because he's such a pivotal figure. Of course, he initially ran for office as a peace candidate, if I recall correctly. So he was, and quite popular, it was quite a popular position. He shifted, as you say, negotiated a tentative agreement within weeks of this war beginning. And the story goes that Boris Johnson or someone from the UK came and, advised against this. But whatever it was, that peace agreement and the discussions you've mentioned did not result in a deal. He seems to have shifted a lot rhetorically. You wrote after Trump's initial proposal went out that, and I quote, it was unwise and thoughtless of Zelenskyy to declare immediately there is nothing to talk about here, end quote. I've also been following, of course, he is the president of Ukraine, public opinion in Ukraine. And while, of course, nationalism has risen, I saw the Gallup poll saying that 52% of Ukrainians poll, and of course, it's tough to poll Ukrainians effectively, but were interested in negotiations right away. And I think, and then there's a Ukrainian sociology think tank called Survation, I think it is, that has also polled, including the occupied territories. And it seems to me that public opinion in Ukraine is shifting, but then you hear things that may be nothing more than folklore, but that, well, the extreme right nationalists, Azov group, and so on would not allow Zelenskyy to cut a peace deal. They'd try to get rid of him or whatever. So I see Zelenskyy. I'm not getting into his character in any way, but I see him as negotiating a very complex and shifting set of political realities. So his immediate rejection of that, initial proposal surprised me a little bit. How does he fit into all of this? Where do you see him, influencing this process?
Well, I think, as you say, there are huge constraints on Zelenskyy from inside Ukraine. I don't know what his own sentiments are now, whether in fact he does now very much want a peace settlement. But I think, this is why, in the end, another reason why the US has to negotiate this deal, because Zelensky's only chance, it seems to me, of selling this to his own hardliners is saying, look, this isn't my fault, and I really, really didn't want it, but Washington has given me no choice. And, he can accompany this if he wants with endless talk about betrayal by the US. But, he can say, look, Trump has threatened that if we don't, that this is take it or leave it time. And he has said, he's told us, if we don't accept this deal as it now stands, and of course, Zelenskyy would have had to be obviously consulted about whether this was acceptable at all. But and Zelenskyy can then say to his own people, look, we can't fight on without US military and intelligence assistance. Therefore, as Hirohito said, in August 1945, we have to bear the unbearable. And so I think that's another reason why, it's right for Washington to negotiate this. But of course, naturally with consultations with Kiev, because, as I say, there are things that even if the US said it would walk away, that Ukraine would never agree to and shouldn't agree to.
Yes, okay. And you're saying, again, just sort of to wrap things up, you're not optimistic a deal is coming soon based on where we are now.
I have a feeling that no, that I hope I'm wrong, but the Russians will have to come back with a sensible and basically acceptable set of proposals very soon, because otherwise I think Trump will walk away from the peace process, not permanently. And Of course, there are hardliners in Russia, and apparently many of the Russian generals who are saying, we should fight on in the hope that the Ukrainians will collapse, or at least that we can win a victory that will allow us to claim military victory. Because, don't forget that compared with what the Russians were hoping for at the beginning of the war, they have not won a victory. Uh, I mean, I'm sure that historically this will be seen as a defeat for Russia, not a victory. I mean, not a complete defeat, or obviously not a complete victory for Ukraine, but still, I have been told that it will be very difficult for Putin to agree to a peace deal if the Russian army hasn't even conquered the whole of the Donbass, for
Mm,
example. So my fear is that the Russians will want to go on fighting at least this year and see how much they can get. But
mm,
then, well, then, it's a question of what happens on the battlefield. And if things proceed as they have for the past year, which is that the Russians do advance, but very, very slowly, with very heavy casualties, and all they gain, are devastated small towns. Then I think, by the end of the year, the Russians will probably be in a, a more compromising mood. And then talks will resume. But of course, there is a terrible risk that, given the exhaustion of the Ukrainian troops, which, there are so many Western reports now of this, and the degree to which they're outnumbered, there is, of course, a risk that the Ukrainian army will simply collapse, and then Russia will dictate the terms of peace. I mean, put it this way: if Russia in the next week or however long we've got does come up with a sensible and negotiable set of proposals, I think the Ukrainians would also be very foolish to reject them, because the odds on, even with continued US aid, the odds on the battlefield are against them. Now, they fought a magnificent fight, and contemporary military technology really favors the defensive. So they have a good chance of hanging on. But, it's only a chance. It's not a certainty.
And lastly, as of the end of last year, the World Bank Working Group on Ukrainian reconstruction estimated the recovery and reconstruction costs of Ukraine over the next 10 years at more than $500 billion. And it's clearly going up every day. So, as we sort of lay the groundwork for people in the West to understand why there needs to be a negotiated settlement, and someday we assume there will be, so hopefully sooner rather than later, will the West continue to supply arms indefinitely in this process, or will it begin sort of reconfiguring its thinking, its fiscal thinking towards helping with recovery rather than I'm asking you to prognosticate, which maybe is not fair, but I would like to see the West think more about helping Ukraine rebuild.
Mm.
And where does that fit?
Well, this really will be a matter for Europe and the European Union. Because under the Russians have said explicitly, and have accepted the American proposal, that while NATO membership for Ukraine is excluded, European Union membership is open. But of course, that requires subsidies and aid in
Mm.
addition to the 500 billion needed for reconstruction of Ukraine as it was before the war. And well, there are two aspects to this. One, I mean, clearly the Russian assets seized by the European Union will have to go towards reconstruction. But I mean, the point is that a deal can be done if the EU is prepared to contribute as well, whereby, say, half of the Russian assets go to reconstruct the Russian occupied areas of
Mm.
Ukraine. I mean, Russia would not be very happy with that because they'd lose about 150 billion. But on the other hand, 150 billion that they'd keep is better than nothing. Um, but of course, how much the Europeans will help, you have all these grandiloquent promises of, the British 100 years pact to Ukraine. But if reform wins in Britain, if Le Pen and whatever it calls itself now, the Rassemblement National wins in France, uh, they're not going to give anything like this to Ukraine, partly because they do not want Ukraine to join the European Union, because it would create such horrible problems for French and Polish and Hungarian and other farmers. Um, so, we'll have to see just how honest a lot of these European promises have been. I think one thing one can say for sure is that apart from this minerals deal, which involves private US investment, under Trump at least, there's not going to be any US aid for this.
Which is we could explore the ethics of that, but we're out of time. So this has been very, very helpful. Again, Anatol Lieven, director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is at quincyinst.org, I believe, right? So please check out their work. It's important. And Anatol, as always, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.